because a lot of people didn't believe in that camera when it came out. I did a review, which is also on CineD somewhere, which was like a short film with crew, which got a lot of traction actually, and people started seeing this, and then I got jobs based on that camera. And you wouldn't believe how many people actually wanted, because at the time, the downsides of the 5D Mark II with all the moire and everything, this was already well known, and all the other cameras. So this was the first camera that didn't have this, even though it was much more expensive. I was able to charge a lot of money for this camera per day, and a lot of people wanted to rent it from me. That was the first time I started renting out my own gear, and this was a great time. And we get like 400 euros per day just for a camera, which was so easy because nobody else had it.
What's new in filmmaking technology this week? News, reviews, education, insights, opinions, and ideas from the CineD newsroom with Nino Leitner and Johnny Bahiri. This is Focus Check, the weekly Cinetech podcast.
Welcome to this special episode of CineD Focus Check. Today we talk about a little bit of a different topic, Johnny, right?
Yeah, today it's a challenging one actually. At least for me, maybe for you it's a bit easier. So what's the topic?
The topic is the best and worst purchases for equipment that we ever made. And I thought this is a very interesting one because it also is tied to how the industry is changing, how in general technology is getting better. And and I'm sure, I at least have a lot of regrets when it comes to how I spent money in the past for equipment.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's even I'm really interested to hear, because I think I have very, very little regrets about stuff.
Really?
I simply don't buy. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, you probably bought. You definitely bought less. But yeah, for me.
So, but let's try to maybe put it into segments.
Start with cameras.
You want to start with cameras?
Yeah.
So everything is about from our industry. Yeah, no pizza ovens and other stuff that we either happy or not. Okay.
Well, now I'm curious. Yeah. Yeah. So cameras. Stuff has changed, right? In general now, I think a less expensive camera can do a lot more than it used to be. Obviously, the differences between cameras are smaller than they used to be. Even if you look at the low end,
connectivity and form factor, basically, that's what really makes the differences today.
So what was the best camera purchase you ever made, and why?
Okay, the best camera that I ever purchased, and again, I have to say it's not because it was the best camera, but the one that brought me most money back was actually a JVC HD 251. This camera, I can't even remember when it was introduced. That was a mini DV camera, and that was more or less about the time that I started to work as a freelance at the BBC. Now, there was a certain standard that we kind of had to compile with, but I could have my own camera. The thing is, I was looking for something that looks professional, sitting on the shoulder, and on the other hand, doesn't break the bank. Because at this time, I could not afford buying, a Betacam SP or anything that literally made no sense, kind of. And you could see that things are moving to digital anyway, and Mini DV was kind of already widely accepted in the market. And this little JVC camera, I remember the day that I first saw it. Yeah, it was such a nice looking camera, literally a reduced version of a big one. But it was a 1/3 inch sensor. That's all, and it came with a Fujifilm lens or Fujinon lens. Sorry, that was actually made for that camera. So the whole combination looked like an amazing package for something that sits on your shoulder. And I could literally charge the BBC for as if I was working with a full-size camera for something that I invested very little money.
Was that, at the time, the challenge often was that they always were talking about 422s, color space, 10-bit, whatever. And very often that was actually the breaking point, is like we all knew that more modern cameras already looked as good as those Beta SB, DigiBeta cameras, but in the end, rarely those cameras were able to record 4:2, right? So how did you deliver the footage?
Well, in all honesty, obviously there was some.
Don't worry, they're not gonna.
No,
it's like want the money back. 15
years
later.
I'm just trying to think and answer accurately. But obviously, for the freelance job that I did at that time, which was mostly news at the beginning, that was not obviously a concern. The only thing that I did, and I invested. What's the name of the company? Not Zoom, the other one, the Japanese company that makes audio stuff, Tascam. Tascam came up. That was a one-of-a-kind product. They came up with like an enclosure with a hard disk inside that you could literally with FireWire output the footage to that enclosure. And I invested in that. That was sitting nicely at the back. So I ended up having a hard copy and a digitized copy of what I just recorded. So I could either hand to the Orbitrak that was still using then the mini DV to play or send
so
by
that's
satellite.
why it didn't matter, because they didn't see the tape and where it was coming from, right?
Exactly. So it was either that or if I had to go straight into editing, I could use the actual digitized.
So your advantage was basically that you were not in the UK. Like if you were shooting for the BBC in the UK, you probably would have to drop the tapes, right? And they would have been like, "What? Are you joking with the mini DV?"
Yeah. So there was, what are you joking here? And of course, the next step would have been really moving into. At that time, there were no mirrorless. That was a DSLR camera, and the first one was actually working with the Canon CineD, and together with
that's when we met.
Exactly. And I'm just saying, I don't want to talk about hero stories, but I think I was really, really one of the first ones to use this system and deliver content to the BBC with a camera that actually has a large sensor format. But anyway, so the JVC, the model again, I really didn't know. That's ages ago. The HD 251 was maybe the best investment that I ever did. I still have the camera somewhere here in the next room. I really wonder if it's still working. I haven't touched it for years, of course. But yeah, that's part of my history. And for you?
Yeah, I'm a little bit younger than you, but the first professional...
Thank you for the compliment.
Well, I have to... the first professional camera I bought was the Panasonic DVX100A. Also mini DV, first or one of the first ones that could shoot 24, 25p. And
which I also had, by the way, but I never used it for... because I think I, again, bought it really early.
Yeah.
But I never had the chance to use it for...
Well, I shot my master's thesis documentary film with this. And at the time, I did, I was only getting started as a freelancer. So it's not that I had that many jobs, but I shot a whole series. I mean, one of my first big jobs here in Vienna was to shoot a series for a big language publisher. And it was like a kids kids program basically that came on DVD with remember DVDs came on DVDs with the book, like like for schools, that I shot with this. But I wouldn't say this was, it was definitely the camera that got me started, but a better, right after that I bought the EX3 from Sony, which was already, I think it was 2007-8, which was just before the 5D Mark II and the 7D and so on. And what ended up happening, I was getting more and more jobs, doing a lot of corporate stuff and small commercial stuff and also documentary stuff, but at that time still more corporate-y stuff. And what ended up happening, the 5D came out, and then I didn't actually buy the 5D Mark II. I also didn't buy the 7D because I just spent so much money on the EX3, which was like 7,000 euros or something, which was crazy at the time. And I mean, even now, but at the time when, you were just getting started. And then I already saw that the possibilities you have with those mirrorless, with those DSLR cameras. But the first one I bought was a T2i. It was called 550D here in Europe. And that's what got me started. And that's when we got in touch. I shot this also little short film that I put online, which is crazy. I think it got like 300,000 views within a few days. I mean, that's something completely unheard of these days for our reviews. But that's what got me started with those DSLR cameras. And what ended up happening for my production jobs was that I would show up. I would, I always like to charge. I mean, we have a different episode where we talk about, like how to charge. And I really recommend this to people and what to charge for when you're shooting. But I always liked to charge for my work and for the equipment separately, which meant that I could basically scale it up if I needed to, or scale it down if I needed to. So if it was a small interview shoot with one camera, of course, it was much less money for a client than it was 2-camera shoot or whatever, or you needed a dolly or whatever. Yeah. And what ended up happening is I always, on the 2-camera interviews, which I already did at the time, I used the EX3 and the T2i, which was it's like 800-900 euro camera. And I ended up 90% of the time the footage from the T2i. But I didn't tell the client because they didn't need to know that the cheaper camera was doing the nicer images, right? Yeah. And I still wanted to charge a little bit more for the more expensive camera. And I managed to, at the time it was really difficult to grade them so they looked alike. But I managed and I came up with a lot that worked most of the time. And yeah, so that camera, the T2i, definitely was because at that time, like you said, with the 7D, not many people were using them. So you were able to get a lot of work from this because people started also seeing this and they were like, wow, how are you able to get this footage? And then one thing leads to the next. And then later, the first quote unquote pro camera with a larger sensor that I bought was the original Canon C300. Which was very expensive at the time. It was like 15,000 euros or dollars. And it was a big decision whether to do this or not, because the EX3 in a way didn't do for me what I was hoping it would do, because of what I talked about. It's like small sensor look already got out of fashion in a way. And I wasn't, I was never the guy to do too much events and that stuff where I actually needed the built-in zoom lens and stuff like that. So or live streaming or whatever. So basically that camera really didn't cut it for me. Probably made its money back at some point, but it wasn't a great business at all. But the C300 from Canon was the opposite, because a lot of people didn't believe in that camera when it came out. I did a review, which is also on CineD somewhere, which was like a short film with crew, which got a lot of traction actually, and people started seeing this, and then I got jobs based on that camera. And you wouldn't believe how many people actually wanted, because at the time the downsides of the 5D Mark II with all the moire and everything, this was already well known, and all the other cameras. So this was the first camera that didn't have this, even though it was much more expensive. I was able to charge a lot of money for this camera per day, and a lot of people wanted to rent it from me. That was the first time I started renting out my own gear. And this was a great time. And we get like 400 euros per day just for a camera, which was so easy because nobody else had it. I think there was a friend of mine of ours actually in Vienna was the only other guy who had it. And both of us were just this camera was in constant use. So this was definitely the best purchase in terms of like financially, because I think it made its money back twice within a very 3 years or something like that. But then things changed, right? Because then
so many other companies have similar offerings. Things are cheaper. Sometimes it's even much cheaper to just, instead of rent, just buy. And if it's many productions, we know it from even the latest one that you did, they prefer to just buy cameras and not rent.
In my observation, it was once those pro cameras drop below 10,000, it's like a psychological barrier. And then that's when a lot more production companies buy gear. And that's what happened with the Sony FS7, which was essentially my successor to the C300. Because when the successor to the C300 was just as expensive, but Sony brought something out that cost like 7,000 in the beginning, they actually got more expensive over time because they realized that they priced it too low, I think. They claimed like parts became more expensive or whatever. But essentially, it started costing more at some point. But so I bought the FS7 and then you immediately saw a lot more people buying that camera, and it got more difficult to, like I was still using it all the time, and I love the camera. And for many years, I think 7-8 years, I used this camera all the time. But essentially, a lot of other production companies would buy it. So it's always like this decision when you buy cameras is like how big is the niche that you are. I mean, if you're considering, of course, are you willing to rent out your own gear? I think you never did really.
No,
or not actively.
Because I was also. I mean, I can also talk about my next EOS 1DC stuff from Canon because you talk about rental, and that was a camera that costed me 10,000 euro, and it made its money back. This is a camera that was introduced in 2012, I think, and of course it was like so much money, but that's also, it was a good school. This is the camera that taught me personally not to invest so much money on a personal camera anymore. My personal target is no more than 2,500, 3,000. That's what I'm willing to spend if I need to buy a new camera, because gear is changing rather fast and the next best thing is always around the corner. And I do love equipment. Yeah. So for some people that if they don't like it, they simply don't care. They just buy something for a very long time. But, so many times we're saying that when you buy something, you don't buy a piece of equipment, you're kind of buying a dream. And with the 1DC, that was the thing, because that was a first camera. I want to say always mirrorless. That was the first DSLR that shot 4K in 24, 25p, and flat picture profile, C-Log, and so on. And you really felt that you are working with something more special, and the images really looked really, really nice. But the thing is, and I remember clearly people already then asking, is it worth investing so much money on a camera that might be obsolete in a very short time? And that's exactly what happened, and we can see how things only got faster since then.
We'll be back after this message from our sponsor.
1 Minute Tips by Fujifilm and CineD. What happens when we want to expose a scene but don't have any way to measure light? Chances are this rarely happens to you, given that we live in the world of digital imaging with automatic exposure built into every photo and video device. But I still think this is a neat trick to know and might come in useful if you're ever working with analog film and forgot your light meter at home. It's called the Sunny 16 rule, and it goes like this. Determine your ISO and match your shutter speed to that ISO. So let's say it's ISO 100, so you set your shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. Then check your lighting conditions. Keep in mind this only works outside. If it's sunny, set your f-stop to 16. If it's a bit cloudy, bring it down to f11. Mostly cloudy, f8. Overcast, f5.6, and so on. Check this diagram if you're watching the video version, or just search the Sunny 16 rule. If nothing else, I hope this helps you develop a shorthand way of thinking of and setting exposure before you even pick up a camera to check your frame. 1 Minute Tips. Until next time.
And now back to the show.
Good, but any other than cameras? Any other equipment that either you like or didn't like in like made sense?
Well, just the last few words on cameras. I think I've also seen, because what you just said, that it's becoming more difficult to justify those expensive purchases. I mean, it's definitely the case also for me, as somebody who's shooting mostly documentaries and stuff like that, because I think the differences for client become less and less for the footage, right? I mean, like we had those big jumps in the past where suddenly you had those filmic shallow depth of field images, and they could also see it difference in sharpness and so on. But now the differences become less and less, and it's more about convenience now to upgrade. But the convenience is very personal. It's not something that you can really translate to the client. So for me, for example, from the FS7, I upgraded to the FX9, and that was before the FX6 was introduced, which I probably would have bought if it was there at the time, which is it's getting a lot more love from Sony still than the FX9, which is not getting any updates anymore. But essentially, the convenience being, I mean, the footage out of an FS7 still looks great, but it was really lacking that autofocus. And the autofocus on the FX9 is just leaps and bounds better. And it's a convenience thing that, like for a long time, I was able to use autofocus on alpha cameras as B cameras, but not on the main camera. And then replacing that with the FX9 made a lot of sense, but it meant that, I'm not able to charge a client more for using this camera really, because you still, unfortunately, have not a better codec in there. I mean, not that it's bad, but you don't have RAW, you don't have ProRes. It's still XAVC-L or XAVC-I actually. And in the end, they get the same kind of footage, which, like even if it was a better thing, it would be an argument. But it's very hard to convince them that you need autofocus suddenly, where you were working without autofocus for so many years. So essentially, you spend 10,000 or 12,000 on a camera like this, and it's not that it would translate in more jobs in a way. It's more a convenience thing, so it's much harder to justify. And then when they released the FX6, I was like many others, of course, it doesn't have the Super 35 4K crop that the FX9 has, but in the end, you get a 4K image out of it, even if it's a 6K camera, but it can only record 4K. So the FX6 would have been and it has become, you've seen, that for a lot of people, the FX6 is really replacing the FS7, and not the FX9, and that's a much cheaper camera. It's 6,000, and it's everywhere, and everywhere they spot that. So again, it's much harder to justify that replacement. So I wonder, even if they, that's why I guess they still haven't replaced the FX6, because I'm sure it's still selling well. Yeah. And they realize that they would really have to offer a lot more in order for people to upgrade, and that would probably be something on par with the C400, which is internal RAW recording. Yeah. So anyway, but justification for more expensive cameras, I agree, is becoming. I for myself decided, it's probably not 3,000, but maybe 5,000 is the limit or something like that, because everything above that becomes hard to justify in this field with so many options out there, and especially also, like you mentioned, the replacement time is getting shorter and shorter. So the amount of time you have to make your money back is also getting shorter. So that's also part of the consideration, and we see this. We see this also with all manufacturers moving into this target market, right? I mean, this mid, it's almost like 3,000 to 6,000 is becoming that area where most of the professional video cameras, and I'm talking about cameras that are not hybrid but really made for filmmaking, are ending up right now, because that's where the biggest chunk of the market is now. Yeah.
When it comes to editing or editing platform or computers or whatever, what is the best decision you ever made, or the worst one? I mean, I can talk about one of my worst decisions, but maybe you first.
Well, I think our common worst decision was to buy the last generation of the Intel 16-inch MacBook Pro just before the M1 came out, not knowing how good that would be.
Exactly.
And I think we still have it lying around at the office, because essentially, we can sell it for very little money now.
Actually, I gave mine to my daughter.
Nobody wants an Intel MacBook Pro anymore.
That's true. But that was again, doing a decision on not based on information that we had. Yeah,
but it's a good example of how better technology sometimes really completely obliterates what was there before. I mean, we all struggled with Intel-based Macs, especially the MacBooks, in terms of battery life and power and sound, like how loud they were, how loud they became when you actually were rendering stuff. So this was probably, the MacBook Pro 16-inch Intel i7, whatever, i9 was probably the worst purchase, but the best one was the M2 Max. Like, and the two we're using here, I mean, it's like there's hardly any reason to replace them.
I can see more and more when it comes to 8K, maybe a little bit, but I'm not that I'm hinting, For me, worst decision was, I don't know if you remember, but for many years before moving to Mac platform, I used, of course, Windows. And one of the things was how to shoot or encode or whatever in a something in terms of equivalent quality to ProRes. And I don't know if you remember, there was a company that introduced Cineform. That was a codec that was introduced by David Taylor, David Newman, and Brian, I can't remember the last name, I think it was 2011. And that allowed, if you had this, that allowed kind of to convert stuff to work seamlessly and effortlessly on Windows. But in order to do so, you needed to, of course, purchase the license. And that was a lot of money for that time. And fast forward, the company was acquired by GoPro. And I have no clue what they did with the Cineform codec. I mean, that never evolved into something that you could have found in cameras and so on, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, it ended up distributing it as a free stuff. So that was, I can't say that it was really covered the cost as a professional editor at that time. But yeah, you can't win all the time.
Mm. Yeah, I was very happy with my purchase of Final Cut Pro 4 or 5 because the upgrades were relatively affordable from Apple up until 7. And then, of course, it didn't get much love for several years before they released or replaced it with Final Cut Pro X, which was hardly usable at the beginning. And then everybody had to moved to Premiere. And I think in terms of like value for money, I still think, especially not that, like if there weren't other good options, I think what Adobe is charging now for the monthly subscription of Premiere would be okay. But considering we have DaVinci Resolve Studio for a one-time sum of $300 or euros, and we have Final Cut Pro 11 now for the same price forever, never charged for any upgrade, both of them. It's a very, very tough thing to.
Yeah, but it's obvious.
I mean, it's something that is almost little enough so you don't notice. But on the other hand, if you think about how much money you spend on Adobe subscriptions over the years, it's crazy.
But obviously, it's not intimidating people still to use it, and I'm included because I think it's always the amount of time that it will take me to learn a new platform, and then really be able to edit blind. Yeah. And I think when you work, you have no time to experiment. You really need a downtime to learn. And I would be so happy to ditch Adobe Premiere and say goodbye. Really. From different reasons. I mean, so many times all of those enhancements that they introduce, and I can show, I don't know how many of obstacles that you go like, but please maybe treat some of the shortcomings first. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying that it's just a matter of the time that I don't have right now to learn a new platform. Yeah, but other than that, what can I tell you? I mean, I think one of the best decisions that's not really related to our industry one-on-one, but is to buy a Panasonic plasma television, for example, many years ago, and I still have it, and I'm not going to let it go until it dies because the colors of plasma are so much better, or the blacks, are so much better than...
you haven't looked at the latest OLEDs.
Yeah, I'll jump straight into projectors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's stick with gear a little bit. I mean, one thing that I definitely, I was one of the first people buying the Freefly Movi M10.
Ooh, yeah. I remember
so
now.
When that was introduced, I don't know, at NAB 12 years ago or something, it was really a revolution because it was the first gimbal stabilizer that you can hold in your hand with brushless gimbals. So up until point, the only gimbals that people knew was like a Cineflex in a helicopter or something very heavy, and not those brushless motors which made
they used
very
Steadicam
small.
Actually. I mean, which is not brushless, but
but the different way of working, and of course a purely mechanical stabilizer, which needed a lot more training and so on. But those gimbals, I mean, the M10. Like I saw this and I was completely amazed, and I tested. I think I bought it, and then I made a review of the one that I bought, and I paid something like, I think I got it a little bit cheaper after some negotiation, but I paid something like $12,000 for it, plus customs and everything, and I mean that's. The original idea was because people were so excited about it at that time that I would first of all, learn myself to become an operator and go on bigger sets with this, and be the guy who's just operating this. And also train a few colleagues and people to use it. And I thought it's much more straightforward for people to learn how to use it. And especially the difficult part about the original Movi M10 was balancing cameras, because the motors were kind of finicky. So every time you did any kind of modification on your camera, you needed to rebalance. And I'm not talking for the people who are now used to using the Ronin series from DJI. This is night and day, because the Ronin motors are quite big and actually they can deal with a lot of imbalance without rebalancing the camera. With the original Movi M10, that was not the case. So you literally needed to be perfectly physically balanced on each. So even if you changed a cable on top of your camera or put it in a different direction, it would not be properly balanced anymore. So it took like 30 minutes every time you did a change on the camera, if you knew what you were doing.
And did you cover the cost of it at the end?
No. That was definitely the worst purchase economically that I ever made, because it was impossible to give this to anybody else. It was just, you felt like a beta tester, and a lot of things didn't work, and the software was very rudimentary. It was only a desktop app, and if you need to configure stuff, there wasn't a mobile phone app, so you always needed to bring a laptop to change stuff and so on. It wasn't great, yeah. Even though what I still like to this day, how light it is, because it's much lighter than the Ronin series from DJI. But on the other hand, at that time, I mean, the M10 was really made for those medium-sized cameras, so I did put on my C300 that I talked about before, and that made it heavy, of course, and you kind of need to stick out your arms like this, and then it just was very difficult to operate.
So it's become a mobile fitness center. And then
when you have the
membership...
It's like, I think I'm going to physical therapy thanks to that. Yeah, so it was really bad for your back. But on the other hand, what was a much better purchase was the Movi M5, which I ended up getting after that. And that's for mirrorless cameras, essentially. The same thing, they shrunk down. And why was that so much better? Well, essentially, they enhanced some of the operation. It was still finicky to balance, but it's much easier to balance small cameras than big ones in terms of general. And what we were missing at the time is a proper autofocus, which the Alpha and other mirrorless cameras didn't have at the time. But what I ended up doing, I used it upside down all the time. So I had this kind of trick, because the problem of those two-hand gimbals was always that the camera is just hanging down. So if you held your hands out like this from your body, the camera ended up being at your belly height, which is much too low in general. And you could use the M10 upside down as well, but it was much more difficult with this big camera. So on the M5, it became almost like second nature, and it's a very lightweight rig, having the camera really in front of your face and using it upside down. I love this setup, and I used this for many years. And yeah, that was completely different. And the price was like $5,000. So it was like a third of the price, and much easier to justify, actually. So yeah, so that's the two ends of the spectrum. So I can only recommend people, don't be the beta tester for something. Sometimes you need to, I mean, with Apple products, I have always been of the opinion to kind of not buy the first generation. I've never bought the first iPhone, then the first, because you know that some things won't work or not as expected. And I made that mistake in this case, definitely. But yeah, the M5 second generation was already much better. And of course, later, Movi Pro, I didn't even purchase because at that time, then already DJI came out with a Ronin and then the Ronin 2, which arguably the first versions were kind of a copy of FreeFly, but then they got so much better that now if you look at a RS4 Pro, it's just amazing. I mean, the ability of this thing, it's crazy what it can do. And I don't think there is a need anymore, as long as you don't use very larger cameras. What I do now, I always have a gimbal kind of ready with a small camera, and don't even put the big cameras on the gimbal anymore, because it just taking too much time on a especially documentary set. It's very easy, much more easy to balance now than it used to be. And it's still required, of course. You need to know how to balance a gimbal, otherwise it won't work as expected. But it's become much, much easier. Yeah.
Good.
But one of those other examples where there's no reason anymore to spend more than whatever 700-800 on a gimbal, because like that market is gone in a way, unless you really need a Steadicam, but then you really need proper training, because this fourth axis is still something that the gimbals don't fix, except if you use the Ronin 4D, of course, which is a camera by itself. Yeah.
Good, Nino. I mean, what can I say?
Do you have any lens regrets? I have a lens regret.
Maybe kind of regret. I can't even remember the focal length. Maybe it started at 35 millimeter. I bought an engineer lens.
I remember, yeah.
Which was more of a collector's item.
Okay.
I thought I'm gonna like the look of it, and yeah, this is from the time that it was the kind of original engineer, and that kind of promised lifetime warranty. Of course, that was a second or third and whatever, but it came really nicely packed, good quality. And when you put it on the camera, you just realize 35 minutes. It was 35 to 70. And the problem was you couldn't really put an ND filter on it, like a variable ND, because the whole mechanism in the front, when you changing the focus manually, it's rotating. So you can't really use the ND filter. But then I had to find a way. I think it was with PhotoDiox to find a rare ND filter to be able to do this, which worked. Maybe I should come back to this just to see, out of curiosity now, after, of course, much more experience and everything. But this is a lens that kind of costed me quite a lot, sitting there in the shelf and waiting for its turn one day.
Yeah, for me it was, I bought a set of Zeiss compact primes, which I used quite a lot because of their versatility. You can just change the mount yourself, and we're able to put, and I still think it's a great set because you can basically put any mount on it. That just made them very versatile. However, then I did this documentary in South Africa, which was partly also sponsored by Zeiss, to test their Zeiss 21-100 lightweight zoom.
One of
3.
the first zoom lenses.
I still like the lens, and I ended up buying it afterwards. However, it was just before full frame became like more common, and I didn't realize how quickly this shift would come. So I didn't use it as much as I wanted to, because it's only covering Super 35. It's still a great lens. However, the 21 on a Super 35 with a crop factor of 1 is effective focal length field of view is around 30 millimeters. It's not wide enough for a lot of things.
Why aren't you selling those lenses or whatever?
This one I should probably sell. I have to check whether there is a good market for that, because it definitely didn't get as much love. Again, I kept this for rent because there were some productions that were renting it regularly, but not anymore. So I actually forgot about it. Yeah. And it's definitely one lens that would deserve more love. So I'll probably sell it.
For me, it's hard to sell because there is no value. I mean, it has an emotional value in some ways.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you want to sell, I don't know, the Canon 1DC is like, how much is this now? Who will buy it?
With cameras, it's very difficult.
It's like, so it's, just leave it as a personal museum thing, like item, and
Yeah. Maybe we have the plan to make this background prettier. Felix is already nodding in the background here because he made suggestions. But, this was we want to have a nice background with shelves and some cameras on it. So maybe we can put them in the back in the future. It's a good plan for 2025. All right. I think we can wrap it up here.
I think we can, because actually I'm happy when we started the conversation, I was not so sure if I will find items that I really
there's always regrets and not regrets about. But if you have any gear purchases, we are very curious to hear what are your best and worst gear purchases that you ever made. Just either comment below the video or on the article, or send us an email at podcast@cined.com. We're happy to talk about it here on the show. I think it's always interesting to hear from the audience about their personal opinions and experiences with gear, and because I think everybody has these stories and they're always a little bit different. And
if you do, you can't avoid mistakes, no? Even purchasing mistakes.
Yep. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, guys and girls, for listening. Give us a good rating on the podcasting platform. Subscribe wherever you are getting your podcasts if you aren't subscribed yet. And again, drop us a line to podcast@cined.com if you want to. Thank you, and hear you next week. Bye.